I have told this story only once before, and that was to a fire, in a room where no one else could hear. But I find, now that I am old and the world has grown quieter around me, that a story like this one deserves more than a pair of ears that cannot repeat it. It deserves to be said plainly, as a man who was there from the first morning to the last evening ought to say it, without ornament, without apology, and without the polite omissions that society demands of us all. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was the closest friend of Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Velmore, for 31 years. I was beside him the morning his steward came to the library door with the letter. I was beside him the evening he returned to the house on the moor and found the gate standing open, and the candles in the window already cold. And I was the one who rode north with him, 7 years later, when the letter came that changed everything. The letter that said she was not dead at all. I will start at the beginning, because the beginning is the only place a story like this one makes any sense. Aldrich was, in those days, what the papers liked to call the most impenetrable duke in the northern counties. They meant it as a kind of compliment dressed up as a warning. He was not cruel. I want to be clear about that because people often confuse coldness with cruelty, and they are not the same thing. He was precise. He was exact. He had been raised by a father who believed that emotion was an indulgence permitted only to people who could afford the consequences. And Aldrich had absorbed that lesson so completely that by the time he came into the dukedom at 22, most people who met him walked away, convinced that he felt nothing at all. I knew better. I had been his friend since we were boys at school, when I watched him quietly give his coat to a younger boy who was shivering in a corridor and then return to his seat and speak of it to no one. That was Aldrich. He felt everything. He simply did it in private, and he did it in ways that required no acknowledgement. The estate of Velmore lay on the edge of the northern moor, 2 days hard riding from London, and it suited him perfectly. The moor was vast and grey and spoke to no one. Aldrich walked it every morning in every weather alone, always alone, the collar of his coat up against the wind, his boot heels striking the stone path with the regularity of a clock. His tenants respected him. His household adored him in the careful, restrained way that people adore those who provide for them without asking to be thanked. And society, when he ventured into it, which was rarely, feared him just enough to leave him largely in peace. This was his life, and I believe he had made a kind of peace with it until the autumn of his 34th year, when a woman named Maren Solis arrived at the edge of Velmore and asked if there was any work to be had. I was there that morning. I had ridden up from my own estate, which lay 12 miles to the south, to spend a fortnight with Aldrich before the London season dragged us both back to the city's noise. We were crossing the east courtyard when Aldrich's housekeeper, Mrs. Farron, met us with the expression she reserved for situations she had not anticipated and was not certain how to classify. "There is a woman at the kitchen gate," she said. "She has come down from the village. She says she is a seamstress, that she is recently widowed, and that she will do any work the house requires. She looks—" Mrs. Farron paused with the particular diplomatic care of a woman who has managed a great house for 20 years. "She looks as though she has been walking for some time." Aldrich said nothing for a moment. "Then is she capable?" "I have not spoken with her at length, Your Grace. I can send her away if you prefer." "Show her to the sitting-room off the kitchen," Aldrich said. "Give her tea. I will come down in an hour." He did not come down in an hour. He came down in 20 minutes. I followed because I was curious, and because Aldrich had never in my memory walked faster toward anything that was not an emergency. She was sitting at the small table by the window when we entered, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that she had clearly been grateful to receive. She was perhaps 26, simply dressed in the manner of a woman who had once had slightly finer things, and had grown accustomed to their absence without bitterness. Her traveling coat was clean but thin for the time of year, and there was mud on her boots that she had made some effort to brush off. Not all of it had cooperated. Her hair was dark and plainly arranged, pinned back in a way that was practical rather than decorative. Her face was one of those faces that does not announce itself. It was not the face that would make a room go quiet when she entered, but it was the kind of face that rewards looking. It had a quality of attention in it, a kind of steadiness, as though she was listening to the room even when the room was silent. Even now, tired as she clearly was, with the cold still in her cheeks and the uncertainty of her situation perfectly apparent, there was no anxiety in her posture. She was simply present, the way a person is present who has learned to live entirely inside the moment they are in, without borrowing worry from the next one. She stood when Aldrich entered. She did not curtsy with the exaggerated deference that some women adopted when they stood before a duke and felt the full weight of the distance between them. She stood straight, met his eyes briefly and without presumption, and waited. "Mrs. Farron tells me you are a seamstress," Aldrich said. "Yes, Your Grace. I have also some experience with household accounts. My late husband was a steward, and I kept his ledgers for the last 3 years." "Where was that?" "Dalmore, Your Grace, in Westmoreland." A brief pause. "Why did you leave Dalmore?" There was something in the way she answered, not an evasion, not a rehearsed explanation, but the plain, settled answer of a woman who has already decided that honesty is less exhausting than its alternatives. The new steward had no use for me, and I had no family in Westmoreland worth remaining for. I walked south. I heard in the village that Velmore is a well-kept house. "It is," Aldrich said. Then, after a moment, "Mrs. Farron will discuss the work with you. If she finds it suitable, the position is yours." He left the room. I lingered for one additional moment, and I watched Marin Solly sit back down and pick up her tea, and I noticed that her hands, which had been perfectly steady throughout that exchange, trembled very slightly as she set the cup down. Not from fear. I thought about that later many times, and I am still certain it was not fear. She stayed. She was given the position of assistant to Mrs. Farron, which meant in practice that she did the work of 3 people, and was thanked for it by being given more. She kept the household accounts with a precision that made Aldrich's estate manager, a formidable man named Cleves who had been suspicious of her from the first day, go quiet with reluctant admiration. She mended. She supervised the maids on the floors above the kitchen. She reorganized the linen store, which had been in a state of creative disorder since before Mrs. Farron's tenure, with a calm efficiency that Mrs. Farron later described to me as both miraculous and slightly alarming. What she did not do was call attention to herself. She moved through the house with the kind of quiet that is different from invisibility, not the furtive quiet of someone who hopes not to be noticed, but the settled quiet of someone who has learned that most of the noise in the world is unnecessary. She spoke when she had something to say. She laughed sometimes at the kitchen table with the younger maids, and the sound of it, I heard it once, passing the corridor, was so unguarded that I stopped walking for a moment. It was a laugh entirely without performance, the laugh of a woman who has briefly forgotten to be careful, and it lasted only a few seconds before settling back into the ordinary sounds of the household, but I stood in the corridor for rather longer than the occasion required. Mrs. Farron told me, in the particular confiding manner she reserved for information she felt was important but had no official channel through which to share, that Marin Solly's had reorganized the household accounts into a system that would have taken Cleves a month to devise, and had done it in 4 evenings. She also told me that the girl had a way with the elder housemaids, the ones who had been at Velmore long enough to regard any newcomer as an encroachment on established territory. That was not charm exactly, because charm implies a kind of performance, and Marin did not perform. She simply paid attention to people. She asked the right questions and remembered the answers. She did not try to make herself liked. She simply went about her work with a quality of genuine interest in the people around her that was, apparently, impossible to resist. Aldrich noticed her. I say this not as a guess but as a certainty, because I know Aldrich's face the way a man knows the house he grew up in, every room, every shadow. He noticed the morning she corrected a figure in the estate ledger that Cleves had missed. He noticed the afternoon she stood in the garden in the rain rather than leave the linen she'd been bringing in for the laundresses to get soaked, her arms full, entirely undignified, laughing at herself for not having moved faster. He noticed the evening she spent an hour reading aloud to Mrs. Farron's elderly mother, who was going blind, and for whom the evening had become a long, dim silence. He said nothing. He was Aldrich. He did not say things. He observed them, filed them in the place in his chest where he kept everything that mattered, and walked on. I began to suspect the size of what he was keeping there approximately 6 weeks into Marin Solis's time at Velmore, when I came down early one morning and found the Duke of Velmore standing in the kitchen corridor. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing, facing the door to the kitchen, from behind which came the sound of Marin Solis talking quietly with one of the maids about the bread order for the week. He was holding his gloves in one hand. He was not wearing his coat, which meant he had intended to go out and had got as far as the corridor and stopped. He heard me on the stair and turned around. The expression on his face was the one I had seen exactly twice before in 31 years of friendship. Once when we were 17, and he had just received the news that his father was gravely ill, and once when he was 25 and he saw a painting in a gallery in Bath that depicted the northern moor in winter, and he had not known it would make him feel whatever it made him feel. He put on his gloves and walked out without a word, and I went and had my breakfast, and I did not say anything either. The thing that matters, the thing I want to be precise about, is that it was not a simple thing. It could not be. He was the Duke of Velmore. She was a widowed seamstress in his household. The distance between those two facts was not a thing that good intentions alone could bridge, and Aldrich knew it with a clarity that was, in its own way, a kind of anguish. He was not the sort of man to indulge himself at a woman's expense, to dangle hope in front of someone who depended on his goodwill for her livelihood, and then walk away when society reminded him of the impossibility. That was not his code. I cannot say it plainly enough. That was not his code. So he did nothing. He was exacting and courteous and entirely correct in every interaction he had with her, and I watched him be all of those things and understood from the inside what they cost him. What I did not foresee was that she had her own quiet storm. I came to understand this in the library in November, approximately 4 months after she arrived. Aldrich had asked me to retrieve a particular estate document from the library's lower shelves, and when I entered, I found Marin Solis already there, not fetching anything, not dusting, simply standing before the shelves with her arms at her sides and her head slightly tilted, reading the spines with the expression of a woman standing before something that gives her genuine pleasure. She heard me and turned, and for a fraction of a moment before her composure reset, I saw something on her face that I recognized because I had seen it on Aldrich's. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Mrs. Farron asked me to dust the lower shelves. I have not yet begun." "There's no hurry," I said. And then, because I had always been the more reckless of the two of us, "Do you read much?" "When I can," she said, in the tone of a woman who means yes, always, every chance I have ever been given. I told Aldrich about it that evening, not as intelligence, not as meddling. I told him the way I would tell a friend that I had found something he'd lost. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "I know." And that was all. But I noticed in the weeks that followed that a particular shelf in the library, the one closest to the window where the light was best, gained a small, deliberate selection of new books. Not rare books, not showy acquisitions. Good books, a history of the northern counties, a collection of philosophical essays in a recent translation, 3 volumes of botanical illustration, for which Velmore's walled garden was a reasonable excuse. No one was told to put them there, they simply appeared. She read them. I know because the library has a particular smell when a fire has been kept up for reading rather than mere warmth, and that smell was there most evenings by February. Aldrich and I never discussed it. Some things between old friends do not require discussion. It was in March that everything went wrong. Aldrich's cousin, Lord Havestock, arrived unannounced on a Tuesday with 2 companions from his London circle, his shooting case, and the particular cheerful obliviousness of a man who has never in his life been told he was not welcome. Havestock was not a bad man. He was simply a man who moved through the world with the breezy certainty that it had been arranged for his convenience, and the subtleties of other people's interior lives were, for him, largely invisible. He was in the drawing-room the following afternoon when Maren Solis came to speak with Mrs. Farron about the week's household requirements. She did not know the room was occupied. She knocked, heard what she thought was an acknowledgment from Mrs. Farron's direction, and opened the door. Havestock and his companions turned to look at her with the automatic, appraising look that certain kinds of men direct at any woman who enters a room. It was not vicious. It was, in its way, more insulting than viciousness. It was simply the look of men who have arranged the world into things of consequence and things that are not, and who have long ago settled the question of which category a widowed seamstress belongs to. "And who is this?" Havestock said pleasantly, to no one in particular. Maren Solis said, quietly and without either aggression or apology, "I beg your pardon, my lord. I was not aware the room was occupied. I will return later." "No need," Havestock said, waving his hand with the easy generosity of a man granting a favor. "Come in, come in. Aldrich keeps a fine household. One likes to know who tends it." He said it entirely without malice, which made it in its own way worse. Because what he was saying beneath the pleasantry was what his entire bearing said: you are a feature of the house, a well-tended feature, not a person in the room. It was at this moment that Aldrich walked in. He had come from the estate office and had not yet removed his riding coat. He took in the tableau in the approximately 2 seconds it takes a precise man to understand a situation, and something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not with any display, but in the way that a landscape shifts when the light changes on it. He said, addressing Maren Solis directly, in front of Havestock and both of his companions, "Mrs. Solis, I believe you wish to speak with Mrs. Farron about the provisioning for the fortnight. She is in the east sitting room. I will join you there in a few minutes, as there are several accounts I wish to go over with you both." It was a perfectly arranged sentence. It did nothing that could be criticized. And yet it said with absolute clarity to everyone in that room, "She is not a feature. She is the person I am going to speak with, and you will wait." Maren Solis met his eyes for just a moment. Then she thanked him quietly and left the room, and Aldrich turned to Havestock with a pleasantness that was, for those who knew him, precisely the most intimidating expression he possessed. Havestock changed the subject. I watched from the doorway and thought, this cannot end simply. It did not. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that before Maren Solis came to Velmore, before she walked south from Dalmore and asked at the kitchen gate if there was any work, she had left something behind. Not the life of a widowed seamstress. Something older and more complicated than that. A name she had used and then set aside. A family, if you could call them that, who had treated her less as a daughter and more as a ledger entry, to be balanced against whatever the world would offer in exchange for her. Her first husband's family had debts. After his death, those debts had been presented to her as though they were debts of her own making, and the men who came to collect them had not been polite about it. She had gone north to Westmoreland, she had worked, she had kept her head down, and when Westmoreland was no longer safe either, because the man to whom the debt had been transferred had longer arms than she had estimated, she had walked south and asked a Duke's housekeeper if there was any work. She had not told Aldrich. She had not told Mrs. Farron. She had told no one, because she had spent years learning that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could do was make herself visible to the wrong people. And the first rule of that survival was to tell no one anything they could use as a thread to pull. I think she knew it could not hold. I think she had always known that the peace of Velmore, the library, the walled garden, the evenings with Mrs. Farron's mother, the specific quality of being in a house where something looked at her and thought, not a feature, was borrowed time. I think she was grateful for every day of it and did not let herself hope it would last. The men came in April, 2 of them, not unkind in appearance but unambiguous in purpose, asking in the village whether a woman of her description had been seen in the area. They had her name. Not the name she used now, but the older name, the one she had walked away from. It was the vicar's wife who sent word to Velmore. She was a perceptive woman who had spoken with Marin at the church several times and liked her, and did not like the look of the men who were asking after her. The word arrived on a Wednesday morning. I was in the breakfast room. Aldrich was not. When I found him, he was in the kitchen corridor again, and this time Marin Solis was before him, and she was not behind her composure in the way I had grown used to. She was standing perfectly straight, and her hands were at her sides, and she was meeting his eyes with the expression of a woman who has already decided what is going to happen next and is sorry for it. "I will leave today," she said. "This morning, if Mrs. Farron can spare me that quickly. I am sorry, Your Grace. I should not have stayed as long as I did." "Who are they?" Aldrich said. "It does not matter." "Mrs. Solis." His voice was, I have spent years looking for the right word for what his voice was in that moment. It was not commanding. It was not the voice of the Duke of Velmore asserting authority. It was the voice of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and is now, in the face of watching it walk out the door, no longer willing to hold it carefully. "Who are they?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him, not everything, not the whole map of it, but enough. The debts that were not her debts, the men who had decided they were hers to repay. The years of moving, of keeping her head down, of not allowing herself to stay anywhere long enough to matter. Aldrich listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You will not leave." "Your Grace." "These men have come to my county," Aldrich said, "and they are asking for a woman who works in my household, and they believe they have a claim on her. I will need you to tell me the name of the man who sold you this debt, the name of the man who currently holds it, and the name of every solicitor who has touched the document, because I intend to spend the next several days making the legal position extremely clear." Marin Solis stared at him. I think she had expected many things from this conversation: anger, pity, the polite regret of a man who could not afford the complication, but she had not expected this. "Why?" she said. It was a question that could mean 100 things. Aldrich chose the plainest answer. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because I would very much prefer that you stay." He left the corridor immediately after, which was typical of him. He had said the thing, and now he was going to do the thing, and the space between saying and doing was not, for Aldrich, a place where he lingered. Marin Solis stood very still for a moment after he left. I was still in the doorway, and she did not know I was there. I watched her close her eyes for just a moment, and I watched her press one hand flat against the wall beside her, briefly, the way a person braces themselves when something has struck them that they were not prepared for. Then she straightened, folded her hands together in front of her, and walked back toward the kitchen, and her back was perfectly straight. I am not a man who cries. I have never found it necessary to make a point of that, but I say it now so that you understand what it means when I tell you that I had to stand in the doorway for a moment before I could follow. The next days were Aldrich at his absolute most Aldrich. He had his solicitor ridden up from London within 48 hours. He corresponded in terms of remarkable and icy specificity with the man who held the debt. There was a meeting, I was not in it, but I heard it from Cleves, who was, and who described it afterward with the shaken reverence of a man who has watched a military engagement won very cleanly. The debt was shown to be fraudulent in its assignment. The men left the county. They did not come back. Aldrich reported all of this to Marin Salis in the estate office, with Mrs. Farron present, as was appropriate. He was correct and clear and precise, and he told her that the matter was resolved and that she was welcome to stay at Velmore for as long as she wished, and that he had taken the liberty of having the legal documents pertaining to the discharge of the fraudulent claim drawn up in her name so that she would have them always, and he handed them to her in a leather folder, and then excused himself because there was an estate matter requiring his attention. I happened to be passing the corridor when Marin Salis came out of the estate office holding the leather folder, and I happened to see her stop in the hall and look at the folder for a moment with an expression that I have never been able to describe adequately. It was not relief, exactly. It was the expression of a woman who has been braced for impact for so long that the cessation of bracing is itself a kind of shock, the strange, unsteady feeling of ground that holds. She stayed. The summer that followed was, I have turned the word over many times and I keep arriving at the same one, luminous. I do not use it sentimentally. I mean it precisely. There was a quality of light over Velmore that summer that I have not experienced before or since, and I am aware that this quality resided less in the weather and more in the particular temperature of the house. Aldrich walked the moor every morning. Marin Salis walked the walled garden every evening. These were established habits, separately maintained, and they had nothing to do with each other, except that the library shelf continued to acquire books, and on 2 separate occasions I went to the library in the late afternoon and found 2 chairs pulled close to the window and a fire that had been kept up for 2, and the particular silence of a room that has recently held a conversation that went on for longer than anyone had planned. I noticed other things. I noticed that Aldrich began taking his correspondence in the library rather than the estate office, which had been his invariable practice for as long as I had known him. I noticed that the meals at Velmore, which had always been prepared competently, acquired a quality that week by week grew into something more considered. Dishes from the northern counties that Aldrich had mentioned once, in passing, were among his preferences, appearing without comment at the dinner table. I did not know whether Marin had spoken with the cook about this, or whether the cook had managed it independently. I suspect the former, but I also suspect that if you had asked Marin about it, she would have said it was entirely the cook's initiative. I noticed that the walled garden, which had been maintained to a standard of orderly utility, began in June to have something more. There were late plantings in the beds along the south wall that I did not recognize as part of the kitchen garden's usual range, and I asked the head gardener about them. He told me, with the slight awkwardness of a man who is not sure how much he is permitted to know, that Mrs. Salis had made some suggestions and that they had seemed reasonable to him. The plants were herbs I recognized from the northern counties, the ones that come up late and hold through the first frost, the ones that require patience. Neither Aldrich nor Marin said anything to me about any of it. I did not ask. There are things you do not ask Aldrich, not because he would be unkind in answer, but because there are some things a man needs to carry at his own pace. What I know is this. On an evening in August, I had ridden over from my estate for dinner, as I did most Thursdays that summer. I came through the south gate of the walled garden and found Aldrich and Marin Salis standing together at the far end of it, beside the old stone wall where the late roses still held. They were not touching. They were simply standing close, and he was looking at her with the expression, I cannot describe it any other way, of a man who has finally allowed himself to look at something he has been very carefully not looking at for a very long time. I went back through the gate. I had my dinner brought to the library. No one mentioned it. In September, the world intervened. Lady Havestock, Aldrich's cousin's wife, a woman of sharp social instincts and considerable influence in precisely the circles most likely to do damage, came north with her husband for a fortnight. She observed, with the swift accuracy of a woman who has made it her life's work to observe, that something was different about Velmore. She could not have said precisely what, there was nothing to point at. But she felt it, the way a navigator feels the change in the current, and she did not like it. The letters she wrote south, I did not see them, but I heard about them later, were apparently quite industrious. They concerned themselves with the subject of the Duke of Velmore's domestic arrangements and the appropriateness thereof. They circulated, as letters of that kind tend to do, among exactly the people most likely to have opinions. The first consequence arrived in October, when Aldrich's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Velmore, made the journey north. She was not a cruel woman. I want to say that clearly. She was a woman who had been shaped by the same world that had shaped Aldrich's father, and she had survived that world by understanding its terms with a precision that had calcified over time into something she could no longer distinguish from belief. She looked at the situation at Velmore and she saw, with perfect clarity, the practical consequences of it, and she came to address them the way she addressed everything, directly, without emotion, and with a certainty that was, in her own mind, entirely loving. She and Aldrich were in the library for 2 hours. I do not know what was said. What I know is that Aldrich emerged from that conversation with the expression he wears when he has been presented with an argument he cannot counter and does not intend to accept. His mother departed 2 days later. The morning she left, she happened to encounter Marin Solis in the corridor outside the linen room, and she looked at her for a moment with the particular gaze of a woman who is simultaneously seeing you and not seeing you, acknowledging your existence and declining your significance in the same instant. "I hope Velmore has suited you," the Dowager Duchess said. "I am told you have been very capable." It was said with perfect graciousness. It was also said with the unmistakable precision of a woman placing a thing exactly where she believes it belongs. Marin Solis looked at her steadily. "It has suited me very well," she said. "Thank you, Your Grace." The Dowager Duchess nodded and moved on, and Marin Solis stood in the corridor alone for a moment, and I think it was in that moment that she made the decision she had been moving toward since April. The decision that the borrowed time was over, and that staying longer would cost something she was no longer willing to let it cost. She came to Aldrich the following evening. I know this not because I was there, but because Aldrich told me about it afterward, in the library, in the winter, months later, when he had arrived at the point where the pain of holding it in private exceeded the discomfort of speaking. She told him she had decided to go, not because of the men who had come in April, that was resolved. It was not that. Not because of the Dowager Duchess, not because of Lady Havestock, not because of anything external. She told him she was going because she had been at Velmore for 8 months, and she was no longer able to live in a house where something was being held at the edge of speech, and neither of them was going to say it, because the saying of it would create a situation that society would not permit, and that she would not allow to harm him. "I would not have it harm you," she said, according to Aldrich's recounting, and the precision of that. Not "I cannot allow it to harm me," but "I would not allow it to harm you," was the thing that had undone him most completely. He asked her not to go. He said it plainly, which was not nothing, for Aldrich, saying a thing plainly is an act of considerable courage. She said she thought it was the kindest thing she could do for them both. She left the next morning before he came down. She left no note. Mrs. Farron told me, when I arrived that Thursday and found the house altered in the way a house is altered when something essential has been removed from it, that Marin Solis had asked her to say goodbye to everyone, and had left with the leather folder and her single bag, and had walked down the south road into the early fog. I found Aldrich in the library. He was standing in front of the shelf by the window where the books were, and he was not reading. He was simply standing there. I said nothing. I sat down. We remained in that room together for a considerable time, and at no point did either of us feel the need to speak. He told me much later that he had spent the following week composing a letter to her. Then he had concluded that he did not know where to send it, and had spent another week trying to establish her whereabouts through avenues open to a man of his resources, and had arrived at a dead end. She had gone south, possibly toward the coast, possibly further. She had friends nowhere that could be identified, family nowhere that would answer. He stopped looking. He had his reasons, and they were his reasons, and I did not interrogate them, but I believe the core of it was this. She had left because she thought it was the kindest thing she could do, and to pursue her was to tell her she had been wrong, and Aldrich could not bring himself to override her choice. She had made so few choices that were freely hers. He would not take that one from her. What he did instead, and I say this because it is the fact of it, the plain and undeniable fact, was leave flowers at the south gate of the walled garden every Sunday morning. He did not discuss this, he did not explain it. Every Sunday in every season, regardless of weather or company or the requirements of the social calendar, Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Velmore, walked to the south gate of his walled garden and left a small bunch of whatever was in season. In summer, late roses. In autumn, heather from the moor. In winter, bare branches from the yew hedge because there was nothing else. In spring, snowdrops, then the first of the kitchen garden herbs, then whatever came after. The gate faced south, toward the road she had walked down, and he left them on the stone ledge beside the gate's iron latch. I asked him about it once, only once. He said, because she walked out of this gate, and I was not there to tell her what she ought to have heard before she did. I did not ask again. This went on for 7 years. I should be precise about what 7 years of Sundays looks like, because I think it is important, and because I was there for most of them. In the first winter it was yew branches and dried heather, laid on the ledge without ceremony. In the spring it was snowdrops, early and fragile and replaced each week. In the first summer it was roses from the garden's south wall, the late ones, the ones that came up after everything else had finished, which I had always thought of as the garden's stubbornest feature, and which I now thought of as something else entirely. By the second year it had become a practice so established that no one in the household remarked on it, or rather, everyone in the household remarked on it among themselves, and no one remarked on it to Aldrich, which amounts to the same kind of silence for different reasons. Mrs. Farron, I believe, was the one who sometimes refreshed the ledge when the flowers had gone past their best before the next Sunday. She said nothing about this to anyone. It was simply done. In the fourth year, a young housemaid who had been at Velmore only 3 months asked Mrs. Farron why the Duke left flowers at the south gate every Sunday without fail, and Mrs. Farron told her that it was not the sort of thing one asked about. The housemaid told me this story herself, years later, and said that she had thought at the time it was a very unsatisfying answer, but that she had come to understand, as she grew older, that some answers are given in the form of the question not being asked. Not without interruption. Life does not pause for grief, or whatever the correct word is for what Aldrich was carrying. Devotion that has nowhere to go is not quite grief, but it is not quite anything else either. He fulfilled his obligations. He went to London when the season demanded it. He attended his cousin's daughter's coming-out balls and his neighbor's harvest dinners and every meeting of the estate and county committees that required his presence. He was not diminished. He was, if anything, more himself than he had ever been in the years before Marin Solly's arrived, as though knowing what he was capable of feeling had clarified, somehow, the quality of everything else he did. He did not pursue anyone else. There were attempts. His mother engineered several, with the gentle persistence of a woman who is too experienced to be obvious about it. Various young women of impeccable family were produced at dinners and parties and country house weekends, each of them lovely, each of them suitable, each of them made perfectly comfortable by a host who was courteous and attentive, and gave absolutely no indication that he had any particular interest in the institution they were being produced to represent. His mother eventually stopped trying in the 6th year. I think she understood, finally, that she was operating on the wrong theory, that what she was offering was a category, and Aldrich had long since become incapable of wanting a category. The letter arrived in November, 7 years after Marin left. It came from a solicitor in the city of Darwick, on the coast, a man named Cheslow who had represented, he said, the estate of Mr. Reginald Colrath, a wool merchant recently deceased. The letter was addressed to the Duke of Velmore, and its contents were, I can tell you, sufficient to cause Aldrich to stand up from his desk so quickly that his chair went back against the wall. He brought the letter to me within the hour. I read it. What it said was this, that a woman named Marin Solis, the name was one she had used in Darwick, had been employed in the Colrath household for 6 years as a housekeeper. She had been by all accounts indispensable. Colrath, who was a widower and a decent man, had died 3 months prior. In his will, he had left to Marin Solis a small house on the edge of the city, a modest annual income, and a letter of reference that described her in terms that caused the solicitor to note in his own correspondence that he had read few more warmly worded documents in 30 years of practice. This would have been enough for Aldrich, enough to know she was alive, that she was housed, that she was well. But the solicitor had included a second item, because Marin Solis, upon being told of the inheritance, had done something that had apparently struck Cheslow as unusual. She had asked him to write to Velmore. She had given him the address and the name, and she had said, "Please write and tell the Duke of Velmore that I am alive and in Darwick, and that I am well, and that I think of Velmore often." That was all she had asked him to include. She had asked for nothing else. No request, no appeal, no proposition. Simply, I am alive, I am well, I think of Velmore often. Aldrich read the letter twice while I watched. Then he set it on the desk very carefully, exactly parallel to the desk's edge, which is a habit of his under conditions of extreme interior weather. Then he looked at me. I said, "How long will it take you to reach Darwick?" He said, 2 days, less if I ride tonight. I said, "Then I suggest you stop standing in my office." He left inside the hour. He took one trunk, his fastest horse, and his valet, and he did not write ahead, because the letter had offered no guarantee, and he was not a man who could bear to have a door closed on him through correspondence. I have pieced together what followed from what he told me later, from what his valet told me, and from one account given to me by the solicitor Cheslow, who seems to have been a man of warm heart and considerable narrative gifts. Aldrich arrived in Darwick on the evening of the 2nd day. He went first to Cheslow's office, where he was expected. The solicitor had, apparently, anticipated that a letter might produce a duke rather than a reply. Cheslow gave him the address of the house. He also gave him, without being asked, the information that Marin Solis was currently and happily occupied, had declined 2 proposals of marriage since arriving in Darwick, and had recently taken up the teaching of reading and accounts to the wives of dock workers, which she did on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the back room of the local church. Aldrich thanked him and left. The house was small and well kept, on a street near the water. There was a light in the front window. He stood at the gate. His valet had the good sense to wait at the end of the street, and he stood there for a moment, which I think was the moment he allowed himself to feel the full weight of 7 years of Sunday mornings. Then he opened the gate and walked up and knocked. She answered the door herself, because she had no housekeeper, and because it was 8 o'clock in the evening and she was not expecting visitors, and so she opened it as a woman opens a door in her own house, without ceremony, unprepared. She looked at him. He said later that she looked well, not merely well in the relieved sense of a man checking a ledger, but well in the specific, particular sense of a woman who has arrived at a life that fits her. Her hair was pinned up in the same plain way. She was wearing an apron. She had apparently been reading. She stared at him for a moment, then she said, "You came." He said, "You told Cheslow to write." She said, "I told him to say I was alive." He said, "Yes." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. He went in. I do not have his account of everything that happened inside the house, because he did not tell me all of it, and I did not ask all of it. But he told me more than I expected him to in the library 3 weeks after he came back. And I think he told me because 7 years is a long time to carry something without setting it down somewhere. And I was the only person who had been present from the beginning and who would understand the weight of what he was describing. What I know is that he was in Darwick for 4 days, and that he came back to Velmore with a particular expression I had not seen on his face before, not happy in the performed sense, but something quieter and more structural than happiness, the expression of a man whose interior architecture has settled into the shape it was always meant to have. He told me, in the library over 2 glasses of wine, the broad outline of it. He told me that she had made him tea, that they had talked for most of the first night, that she had told him about Darwick, about the Colrath household, about the Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the church, and that he had listened the way he listened to things that mattered to him, completely, without interruption, with the full weight of his attention. He told me that he had said, at some point in the conversation, that he was sorry she had left Velmore believing that her presence cost him something, that it had not, that the only cost had been her absence. He told me that she had looked at him for a very long time and then said, "I know that now. I think I may have known it before and been frightened of it." He told me that he had asked her, formally, clearly, with full knowledge of what he was asking and what she would be undertaking, and what the world would say, and precisely how little that moved him, if she would come back. She had not answered immediately. She had, he said, taken several minutes. She had walked to the window and stood looking out at the street, and he had waited in the chair by the fire, which was where she had set him, and he had waited with the patience of a man who has had 7 years of practice at it. Then she turned around and said, "Aldrich." He told me that was the first time she had ever used his name. He said, "Yes." She said, "I have a school on Tuesday and Thursday mornings." He said, "Velmore has a church. It also has rather a large number of tenant families whose wives and daughters might benefit from Tuesday and Thursday mornings." She looked at him. He said, "I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking you to bring it with you." She said, "And the rest of it, what society says?" He said, "I have been managing society's opinion of me for 34 years. I find I am recently less interested in the project." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You left flowers." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Farron told you." "She wrote," Marin said, 3 years ago. She was not trying to, she simply said. She said she thought I ought to know. She said you had left them every Sunday since I walked out the gate." Another silence. "Yes," Aldrich said. She said, "For 7 years." He said, "Yes." She looked at the window. She looked at the fire. She looked at him. Then she said, "Yes." They were married in the church at Velmore on the first Sunday of January. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind of northern January morning that has no interest in softening itself for the occasion but is magnificent anyway. The sky a precise pale blue above the moor, and the frost hard on the churchyard grass, and the smoke from the village chimneys rising straight up in the windless air. The church was full. It was attended by the household and the tenant families and half the county, the latter divided approximately equally between those who came to celebrate and those who came to observe and be confounded. Both groups, I am pleased to report, witnessed the same ceremony, which meant that the second group was obliged to sit through something that did not provide the spectacle of awkwardness or mismatch they had perhaps come hoping to identify. She wore a gown the color of winter morning light, not the elaborate confection that the occasion would have demanded of a bride from a higher station, but a gown of such simplicity and such perfect fit that it managed to make everything around it look overdone. She carried no flowers. She had asked Aldrich, when he offered to see to the arrangements, whether she might instead have the flowers from the gate. He understood what she meant. He had them gathered from the walled garden, all the winter flowers and the heather and the branches of yew, and they were tied simply and put in her hands, and she carried them to the altar, and that was that. I stood in the front pew and I watched Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Velmore, take Marin Solis's hand at the altar, and I watched his face when he looked at her, and I will not describe it in detail because some expressions are not for describing. I will say only this. It was the expression of a man who has been standing at a gate for 7 years and has at last been permitted to open it. Society had its opinions. It voiced them through several months of correspondence and several very pointed conversations at various London dinners, and none of it produced any visible effect on either of them. Lady Havestock made her feelings known at a house party in February, at which Marin was not present but I was. She said, to a circle of approximately 8 people, that the whole affair was simply incomprehensible, and what could the Duke have been thinking? I said, pleasantly, that I believed the Duke had been thinking very clearly, and that Marin Solis was among the most capable and admirable women I had ever encountered, and that the Duke of Velmore was, moreover, a man of sufficiently formidable judgment that his choices tended to resolve all questions of their own merit within a year or two. Lady Havestock looked at me for a moment, and then changed the subject, which was, I feel, the correct outcome. The Dowager Duchess came north in February. She and Marin spent 2 days together at Velmore. I was not there for most of it, but Aldrich told me afterward that on the second evening, he had passed the library door and heard his mother and his wife in conversation. A genuine conversation, not the polite performance of 2 women navigating each other's territory, but a conversation of the kind that happens when 2 precise, perceptive people discover that they are both more interested in accuracy than in performance. He did not interrupt. He went to the estate office and worked on the accounts for an hour, and when he came out, the library fire had been kept up and there were 2 cups on the table, and the sound of voices had stopped, and he found his mother in the corridor putting on her shawl, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her face very often. She said, "She is formidable." He said, "Yes." She said, "I did not see it." He said, "No." There was a silence. Then his mother said, "Well," which was, for the Dowager Duchess of Velmore, a complete capitulation, and they both knew it. The Tuesday and Thursday mornings began in March. The back room of the Velmore church was put to use twice a week, and by June there were 11 women coming regularly, and by October there were 17. Some of them were the wives of tenant farmers who had never had occasion to think that reading and accounts were within their reach, and who discovered, in the back room of the church on Tuesday mornings, that they were. Some of them brought daughters. By the end of the first year, there were women who had come to Marin barely able to sign their own names, and who were now, quietly and without fuss, keeping their household's accounts in small neat ledgers that Marin sourced from a stationer in the nearest town. Aldrich paid for the ledgers. He did not tell Marin he had done this. She found out approximately a month in, when she went to settle the stationer's account, and was told it was already settled. She came home and found Aldrich in the estate office, and looked at him for a moment with an expression I was not there to see, but which I am told was a very particular combination of exasperation and gratitude. He said, apparently, that the estate had an education line in the accounts, and it was simply a matter of using it correctly. She said, apparently, that the estate did not have an education line in the accounts, and that she knew this because she had read the accounts. He said that it did now. By the following spring she had written a letter to an education society in the city, and they had written back with some interest, and correspondence was ongoing, and Aldrich had, without mentioning it, arranged for the south side of the estate to have a new outbuilding put up, which everyone in the household knew about except Marin, because everyone in the household had been, with some difficulty, persuaded to say nothing. It was finished in April, and Aldrich walked her to it one Tuesday morning before the women arrived for their session, and opened the door. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. The room was well proportioned and warm, with good south-facing windows that let the morning light in at a practical angle over the long table that ran down the center. There was a proper fire already laid and lit. The floor was clean stone with a rug, and along the wall, on shelves that had been fitted with the same careful attention that Aldrich brought to every project he undertook, were books. Not rare books, not showy acquisitions chosen for appearance. Good books, a history of the northern counties, a collection of essays in the recent translation, practical volumes on household accounting and the natural sciences and the art of correspondence, and at the far end of the shelf, nearest the window where the light was best, a row of titles she recognized because she had read them herself, years ago, on a shelf in a library at an estate on the northern moor where someone had placed them without explanation and trusted her to find them. She stood in the doorway for a long time. He stood behind her and said nothing. He was Aldrich. He had said the thing and he had built the thing, and the space between saying and building and this particular moment was not, for him, a place for words. He had done the thing and here it was. She turned around. She looked at him with an expression I was not there to see. He told me about it afterward. In the particular way he told me things that mattered, which is to say simply and without elaboration, because he trusted me to understand what the simplicity contained. He said she looked at him the way a person looks at something they had stopped believing they were permitted to want, when it turns out to have been there, waiting, all along. She took his hand. He held it. And that, in the end, is the only story there is, a man who left flowers at a gate for 7 years, because he could not think of anything more honest to do, and a woman who finally told a solicitor to write to Velmore because she thought of it often, and what happened when those two things arrived in the same room. I have told it now to more than a fire. I believe it will bear the telling,